Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, it's been a while since we've had a disc-focused video, and there's been a reason for that, in fact. It's been that disc has been bugged most of alpha and beta, making it enormously difficult to actually see how the spec's performing. Thankfully, with the latest build on beta, they fixed some major bugs of the spec. The Void Wraith that you get out of the Void Weaver hero talent was transforming your Shadow Fiend or Mindbender into an extra special squid that blasts enemies from a distance. Well, it finally converts into atonement healing, so we can actually see how it performs. On top of that, it was not getting the correct amount of cooldown reduction from the Void Summoner talent, where your smites, penance, etc. was reducing the cooldown of your next pet. They just now fixed that too, but only for Void Wraith. And so Shadow Fiend and Mindbender, when not spec'd into Void Wraith, are getting twice the amount of cooldown reduction that they ought to be, which is a little irritating. But I can at least say, from them finally fixing the Void Wraith itself, Discipline Priest has a problem, okay? From a Mythic Plus perspective, the number one problem that they have is their atonement output. Now, Disc has a custom atonement modifier for a dungeon environment. They do, at the moment, 70% more atonement healing in a 5-man environment, which is a really easy tuning knob they can adjust. It's fantastic. We love it, right? Great. But the problem is, you either feel extremely strong when you have your pet out, or you don't have your pet out and you feel exceptionally weak. Now, the other side of the strength that you have with your Void Wraith up is that you don't have the tier set bonus from Season 3 and Season 4, where your smites are extending the duration of one of your atonements. And so your overall atonement uptime gets really, really low with the War Within Season 1, because you lack all these extra sort of resources that you have on hand. Your tier set bonus gives you a flat atonement increase, and it gives you a buff to either your shield or your Mind Blast. And in a raid environment, that gets very screwy very quickly. But in an M+ environment, yeah, you might be able to cast a shield every 3 or 4 globals, something along those lines, and be casting smites in between. But you don't want to be casting a couple smites and then shield an ally, and cast a couple smites and then shield an ally. That's not how the spec works. You are hitting Radiance onto your allies, blasting a whole bunch of damage, and then kind of cooling down from there, and getting your next pet uptime, getting resources on hand, like your Mind Blast back, so you can just burst another big window of damage. And so that shield aspect feels very wasted. In a raid environment, this tier set bonus is just awful because you're shielding to have longer lasting atonements from, I believe it's Indemnity, and so you want to use shields for your ramps, but then you're consuming your Mind Blast buffs so that you can't burst as high as you'd like to. So the tier set 4 piece is just a mess at the moment. But back to dungeons. The spec has some output problems, both for very short lasting atonement durations, and even if you're taking something like Enduring Luminescence, where you get a little bit longer of an atonement duration, then there's just such a frequency of damage that it feels like you are gasping for air and just being able to apply long enough atonements to get damage off, to heal your allies. And if you just applied a single atonement to somebody and then somebody else takes damage, you have to find a quick way to be able to top that person off, protect them, save them from some of the incoming hits. What Disc did really well in Season 3 of Mythic Plus was just being able to almost brute force Radiances into allies to constantly have more atonement onto them and push their health pools back up to full whenever big hits were coming. You weren't really just single target atoning anybody. Your Rapture usage would be preemptive, just like how the revamped Rapture is probably going to end up being utilized. It's not really something that saves somebody from a mistake. You're using it in preparation for mistakes to end up happening. And so Disc has a really notable number of weak spots from a healing perspective, to the point that I was also running uppies just to be able to have some other kind of healing cooldown on hand to make it slightly easier to be able to sustain my allies. Unfortunately, uppies also has the problem that you still get killed by ground effects, and I don't know why you fly in the air and then get killed by ground effects by the flying tool. The flying seems like a downside at that point. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. But that being said, it's well, what other options are you really going to be able to take? If you're a Void Weaver, well, Twilight Equilibrium is out because all your spells turn into Shadow, right? Expiation has been bad since the revamp in Season 3 because you're not casting as much Mind Blast. You can cast lots of Shadow or Deaths, but that's as the mobs are dying. and you don't really need more strength at that point. You're already very strong in the execute. You're weaker when mobs are at high health. You're weaker when bosses are at high health, right? So that doesn't really kind of solve your scenario. The Uppy's additional talents, like the cooldown reduction talents, are enormously expensive. Things like Aegis of Wrath are particularly weak. Divine Aegis was nerfed as well going into Season 3, and so that's going to be pretty weak when you have very low amounts of crit. Wheel and Woe has been okay for a while, and you're probably going to see more play just sort of by inertia, really. And the cooldown reduction you get at the moment out of Void Summoner doesn't allow you to get enough uptime to feel powerful and to consistently feel powerful to push up health bars. You are at such a strong point when you have Shadow Covenant up and such a weak point when you don't that it feels like very extreme, really, for a dungeon environment, which might require some more consistent output overall. From a class tree perspective, the spec still has an enormous amount of 2-pointers in their tree. In fact, while we've seen Shamans get a class tree revamp, Priest hasn't gotten one really ever. They've gotten a couple talent node changes, a couple adjustments here and there, but you still have an entire wall of like 2-pointers, which are gating your access to the final row of capstones. And so as a result, you're burning a lot of these points on, things like Twist of Fate or with like Unwavering Will, where you have to spend all of these points instead of taking even like a little bit more crowd control, even taking something like Psychic Voice for 15 seconds more of Psychic Scream value, You need to take your Feather, you need to take Protective Light, you need to take your Dispels, you need to take all of these things for Shadow or Death or whatever. And so as a result, you're just really constrained in that class talent tree. And while it feels like it hasn't been a crisis situation for Priest for a while, it's been stagnant for a while, and I think it's high time that they actually make a couple different changes to the class tree. And honestly, we need to have a kick for this incoming season. Not having Vengeance Demon Hunter's insane amount of stops really hurts Priest, because then you need to find stops from somewhere else. And sometimes you're going to have a meta DPS, which doesn't have a lot of good stops, and so you're going to look for the healer to bring in those stops to make up for it. And so healers like Resto Shamans, healers like Resto Druids, Mistweaver Monks, Paladins all have heaps of stops. I mean, Preservation as well, although we're kind of assuming that Augmentation is still going to be in the mix, so it kind of hurts Preservation's representation. But Priest is the notable exception to healers having a kick, and even healers having like a couple different stops to do something. Fear on its own is so like really just niche. You have to actively have all the mobs stacked together, and people have to be damaging them to then fear them. Then the fear will actually break, because the second that mobs start running away and they get out of the trash pack, then your fear is an active negative to the group. And so you have to be very careful with how you use a crowd control like that compared to Blinding Light, Disorienting Roar at a Druids, Leg Sweep, Thunderstorm, like all of these other things are just objectively good. Objective wins every single time, unless you snipe somebody's kick. But Priest, notably, is just lacking in that department. There's some times where Dominate Minds can have some like niche value. They can take a caster out of a pack, but there's no more Spiteful, there's no more Incorporeal. There's no real use for Shackle Undead in this dungeon pool without any undeads. I guess there's some in like Necrotic Wake, right? But not many. And most of the time, you don't want to actually CC them that way. And so as a result, it's kind of just wondering what Priest is going to bring to the table. Power Infusion can carry the spec for a while, and kind of preying on us actually having like the mage to target so that we could get our representation feels like a really poor justification for like why we should be brought to a dungeon, in my opinion. The spec tree is just riddled with dead branches, as I'd mentioned previously, and it seems like Disc in particular, but Holy as well. I think that Holy spec tree, to be fair, is much more well-rounded, but Discs is so heavily focused into Shadow Covenant uptime, and you still have these like Klingons from, I don't know, PvP-related things like Contrition, Aegis of Wrath, where they just exist just because, inertia, I guess. There's so many of these things that you don't access regularly and don't take advantage of regularly that it really makes you wonder why they're there to begin with. Meanwhile, you have talents like Shadow Covenant, which you are so dependent on them to do any sort of healing to begin with that, you're forced down a very specific path of talents. And in like a raiding perspective, you really don't have a great amount of options and flexibility for how you're going to actually end up playing. We have been following the modern version of Disc ever since 7.2.5 in Legion, when they revamped Powered Radiance and they added Evangelism into the table. And as a result, we've been following a very similar formula for a while, but having the Smite follow through with cooldown reduction is a wrinkle that is causing some pretty severe problems both for raids and in M+. From M+, like I mentioned a number of times, you want to be dispelling or using crowd control or doing something to help the group, but if you're not smiting enough, you're not getting enough pet uptime, you feel super weak, you use your pet, you don't have much atonement uptime, and there's no way to extend it. In a raiding environment, you have the option between a 2-minute Void Wraith if you respect into Shadow Fiend, and so if you don't talent into Mindbender and you are talented into Void Wraith, your 3-minute Shadow Fiend becomes a 2-minute Void Wraith. If you are talented into Mindbender and you talent into Void Wraith, then the Void Wraith's cooldown is a minute. As a result, in that vein, you do have some decent options for how you'd want to play it, although it's extremely difficult to play the 1-minute Void Wraith and then be able to have it available every 30 seconds or so, the way you were kind of used to it in a Mirgersil like Season 3 progression if you just casted enough smites. What I really enjoyed the most was actually playing with the Shadow Fiend like 2-minute setup, which made it really easy to, one, play uppies for like a sort of mini ramp, or to be able to take advantage of like canceling my entropic rifts early for my mini ramps, so that way I could put together just a bit more burst output when I really needed it. It took a lot of stress off of having to hit like the amount of cooldown reduction, especially as I'm like learning fights. Took a lot of pressure off of having to smash a whole bunch of smites to get a 1.5-minute cooldown on my Void Wraith to make sure I could hit my timings. Usually what I hit when I was playing with Shadow Fiend was almost like a 45-second cooldown. And so I think if I really optimized my gear in Season 1, I could probably play around some sort of like 45-minute adjusted cooldowns. But the nice side of it, though, is that you do have good options for how you'd want to play in accordance with what the boss fight's actually going to throw at you. When we played on, I think it's like the Broodstalker, the big Cahoon-looking dude, it was really easy to have my Shadow Fiends timed for when he's consuming all the black blood, which is making it like ridiculous amounts of AoE damage, negative heal absorbs, huge pressure onto the group. And so I didn't really mind holding on to my Void Wraith a little bit longer if I had it for like that perfect timing where I could really carry as a spec. So that being said, I think Disc is going to be very good for the incoming raid, but also insanely awkward in some moments for how you want to time your pet, how you want to adjust your setup to account for the atrocious tier set bonus. But I think this is going to be really good in raids because there's still going to be moments where they can carry and they're absolute beasts at healing through negative heal absorbs. They can pretty much get there first before most healers can. Being able to adjust between Shadow Fiend or Mindbender for optimal timings to carry at those moments should be really easy or on the easier side. And Barrier is like way better than Symbol now. It's actually pretty gross because they nerfed Symbol to only be 30 seconds of defensive cooldown reduction as opposed to the minute that it was previously. It is so much harder to effectively defend your group after big AoE hits are happening with something like Symbol when you can just get everybody stacked into a barrier instead. So some potential solutions for Disc going forward. Obviously, the atonement number needs to get adjusted, especially for a Mythic Plus environment. One of the things I'm really confused about is Sins of the Many. This talent was implemented basically to be an independent tuning variable. So basically that 70% atonement buff that we get in dungeons is that variable now. They were making it so that Sins was buffing your damage, so that it felt like you had better healer damage in a 5-man. You also did better healing in a 5-man. But now they've already given you this tuning knob already there. So I'm not really sure why it still exists. The spec will continue to just rail damage on boss fights in a raiding environment, in big part because of something like Sins of the Many. But I don't really know why they still actually have that on the board when they already have an independent modifier built into atonement healing. Rapture still feels really, really awkward in a raid environment. I don't think it felt good at all in Dragonflight. You get a couple extra atonement duration, couple seconds of atonement duration out of it. Like, meh. It still doesn't feel good to be utilizing either in raids or in M+, to be quite honest with you. I think the times I felt like it really was impactful was in Shadowlands when it naturally gave really long atonement uptime, and never really felt that good in a dungeon environment, and I still don't think that it does. Luminous Barrier is just a god-awful menace, and I really hope they delete it. I dead cringe every time I see people actually talenting into that garbage. Even with the 500% buff in dungeons that they did, it's still terrible. And like I mentioned before, there's a lot of dead branches on the tree. So for a potential solution standpoint, fix the dead branches. I think they should, short of them redesigning the whole spec all over again, I think that they should actually just buff Void Summoner so you have more cooldown reduction, so you can reliably be getting your like 30-second burst ramps as disc, where you can be playing like Mindbender and Mindbender for your evangelism window, and then 30 seconds later when you get your double radiance back again, you can Mindbender again, and so on and so forth, kind of like how we were playing in Amirdrasil, but also cap that cooldown reduction so that we don't get into degenerate forms of like, let me stack 50% haste and just mash smite, even if I miss radiance casts, so that way I can, you know, hit these insane Shadow Fiend ramps. That stuff is super cringe. It felt really awkward in dungeon environments too, when you just had to do other mechanics, so I'd much prefer a capped version of Void Summoner so you can quickly get your cooldown reduction and then go about your business doing mechanics, CCs, yelling at your DPS for not kicking, whatever it might be. I did also have an opportunity to play with Oracle Disc Priest. I didn't forget, and just like you shouldn't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content, but Oracle felt like it was really only going to be good during like farm content when the overheal is going to be higher, so I'm not a huge fan of that. It was kind of cool to like insight into like piety, even though it burned an insight charge for like the cooldown reduction, but it meant that I could cast another round of penances, so I could like hit 3 penances back to back. That was like pretty cool, but the spec just does not feel really strong at the moment. I'm not sure exactly what they're gonna do, since it's, no matter what they turn Oracle into, it's basically gonna be requiring an absurd amount of work to min-max and like yield the best value from. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to be pretty mid. I think most disc mains just want Voidweaver to be good, and I certainly count myself in that boat. Let me know if there's anything I missed, or if you have any questions about the spec headed into the War Within. I'm excited to main it, I'm excited to play it alongside Holy Priest, but I think there are some pretty glaring issues for the spec at the moment that in particular are going to mess with my fun for a Mythic Plus environment, and probably give me some irritation throughout raid progress as well. Big thank you to our patrons, Twitch subs, and YouTube channel members for making all of this possible. If you'd like to support, check them out in the description down below. Thank you for watching, hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.